should I have
Welcome to Media Path. I'm Fritz Coleman.
And I am Louise Palanker.
Here on Media Path, we try to curate your free time. Life is complicated enough without you having to scroll through endless new media selections. You don't have time. Maybe you're trying to drive back from Burning Man. You don't have time. So we're here to be your cherry pickers in chief. And if any of you listeners have dreamt of a career in writing for television, don't even delude yourself into thinking you can make it happen until you read our guest book today. He's Jeff Melvoin, a writer, a producer, an educator. He's written and produced hundreds of hours of television, and he's the author of a terrific new book called Running the Show, Television from the Inside. It's his personal experiences in writing and producing television. It's a reality check. It's a how-to checklist for anyone ready to launch into a TV career. Jeff will be with us in just a few minutes. Weezy?
Fritz, I said look immediately to your right. Jeff is already with us. That's him right there.
Right.
Yeah. But he'll be talking after I talk about the Beanie Baby.
And what is your selection of this? I appreciate
Okay. It's called The Beanie Bubble, loosely based on a book by Zach Bissonnette called The Great Beanie Baby Bubble. The Beanie Bubble is on Apple TV, and it stars Zach Galifianakis as Ty Warner, the person behind the Beanie Baby craze, which gripped our nation in the 90s. Or is he? This film tells the story of the three women whose energy and ingenuity propelled Beanie Babies onto millions of American beds, bookshelves, car dashboards, and cubicles. Two of these women were love interests. One had children who added invaluable input. One was an ingenious intern whose early online acumen, clever tag poetry, and manufactured scarcity concepts were fishers of beanie collectors. Ty Warner's one true gift was cultivating associations with brilliant and devoted women and keeping them close enough to use but far enough to hoard the credit and the empire. He never married either girlfriend. Thus, they got nothing. The intern was kept on an hourly salary. What ultimately happens when loyalty flows in only one direction? Why is it called a bubble? Here is Ty Warner's statement about this version of history. He actually finally spoke to the press about this film. He said, "The movie is, by its own admission, partly fiction. But like the filmmakers, I am in the business of dreams, and I admire their creative spirit." He also thinks he's much more handsome than Zach Galifianakis, and that he should have been played by Daniel Day-Lewis or Warren Beatty. So in Santa Barbara, this movie played in theaters because Ty Warner owns hundreds of coastal acres in Montecito on which he's planted vegetation from throughout the world. It's entirely secluded. You just see the giant trees that block your view of the opulence. Folks who read about him in town may think that his middle name is Ty and that his first name is Reclusive Billionaire. That is how he is usually mentioned. He owns a bunch of hotels in town, including the gorgeous and legendary Biltmore, which remains shuttered post-pandemic due to a labor dispute between Ty and the Four Seasons that has dramatically impacted 450 employees. This stubborn, recalcitrant, narcissistic behavior tracks with Zach's portrayal in the film. And may I add that I would be honored to have Zach portray me in a film. He is quite lovely. So if you're interested in delving further into the Beanie Baby history, there is a really cool podcast. It's an episode of a podcast called You're Wrong About with Sarah Marshall and Jamie Loftus, which fully explores Ty's parasitic relationship with the women in his life.
Nice. Mm-hmm. I would have never watched that without your recommendation.
I found it
believe
fascinating.
They made a movie about Beanie Babies.
Right. It's more than about stuffed animals. It's about
I hope so.
It's about so much.
That's a long 90 minutes. All right. Well, as you know, I love music documentaries.
Yeah.
Here's one streaming now on MGM Plus. It's San Francisco Sounds, A Place in Time. It's a two-part series, a look at the musical and artistic renaissance that happened in the Bay Area from the mid-'60s to the mid-'70s. It's about the seminal groups that grew their roots in San Francisco and later blossomed into the acts that dictated a global music trend. Bands like Jefferson Airplane, Grateful Dead, Steve Miller, Janis Joplin, with and without Big Brother and the Holding Company, Country Joe and the Fish, Santana, Sly and the Family Stone, Tower of Power, Doobie Brothers, Creedence Clearwater Revival. And they use a recent documentary trick of doing voiceovers without showing the video of the actual people speaking, which kind of adds to the mystique. This movie was done by the same folks that did another outstanding film about music called Laurel Canyon, about the same time period. What allowed all the groups to coalesce into solid music units is that they all lived in their own houses, everybody under the same roof. It was like a freestanding musical commune, many of them all in the Haight. This was a time when music was free and experimental, and as you listen to the tracks, you realize that many wouldn't even have gotten played on the radio or streaming now. They were so sort of freewheeling and experimental. And this was about more than the music. It was a social experiment going on in the Bay Area. Lots of drugs were taken, not to numb your mind, but to expand your mind. It looks at Bill Graham, the iconic music promoter that ran the Fillmore, which was the epicenter for all this new music. And you get to feel the upheaval in America that touched off this whole counterculture mindset. With Vietnam in full rage, it was youth looking for a newer, better way. At the end of the movie, you realize that what filled the air, even more than the pot smoke, was a fuzzy, warm naivete. All the lofty and pure ideals born in that time and that place through music and social experimentation are depressingly different from the world in which we find ourselves today. Beautiful music, great piece of music history, San Francisco Sounds, A Place in Time.
Right. I watched the first episode last night, and it gets to that point where we'll call it the bubble bursting, which in this case is too many people finding out about it. So they heard about it at the big music festival, Monterey Pop, and then up they come, and now it's like, oh my God, this place is too crowded, which makes me feel like maybe there should be some version of this in every town, that folks are attracted to this kind of creativity and this kind of like open-mindedness and spirit of.
And here's the arc of commercialism.
Mm-hmm.
As soon as all that music started to get famous and it became the top 20 of the top 40 playlist, then it became commercial, and then people just sought it out to be, to stand next to the flame, and then it went downhill.
I think they were just pissed at their parents, and they needed a destination.
That was the point of the whole thing.
Oh, yeah, Dad. Mm-hmm.
I'm so happy to introduce our talented guest today, Jeff Melvoin. This man has written and produced some of the most noteworthy shows in television history. Remington Steele and Hill Street Blues and Northern Exposure, Picket Fences with a great David E. Kelly, Alias with a great J.J. Abrams, Designated Survivor, and others, around 470 hours of television. He also founded the Writers Guild of America's Showrunner Training Program and the Writers Education Committee. He taught at Harvard. He's written a terrific book, too. It's his personal experiences getting started and staying relevant in the television landscape. It's practical ways to get a job as a television writer, and it's tips on how to work your way up the ladder to showrunner from pitch to the bleeding ulcers. It's all there in one book. It's called Running the Show, Television from the Inside. Jeff Melvoin. Happy to have you here, Jeff.
Thanks. Delighted to be here.
I love this book. It was so good for those of us that have been on the periphery of this business our whole lives. But let's start off talking about the elephant in the room, Writers Guild strike. Can you give us any update? What are you hearing? What's the
I don't have any insight beyond what's generally available, but I think we're still in it for the long haul. I don't think there's any ongoing talks going on right now, but I've never seen the Guild more resolved, and SAG also has been very inspiring in that regard. This is my fourth strike,
yes,
and the word existential has been applied to it, and it really is. What's at stake here is an entire method of how we created television. And there's other issues, of course, but that to me is one that's nearest and dearest, is the whole concept of having a writing staff, using a writer's room. These are things that were never in any contract. Every 3 years we negotiate what's known as the MBA, the Minimum Basic Agreement, with the AMPTP. And there was never any need to specify that you needed writers and a room to write a show. It was just assumed. Now it's no longer assumed.
Yeah. I think something showed up in this strike. I've been through a few in this town as well. And something that showed up on this that really drives the point home is some of the stars who are, some of the most noteworthy stars have decided to publish their residual checks on social media, and people are flabbergasted at how little, because they think everybody in show business makes a boatload of cash. And I made $2.40 for my Perry Mason rerun 25 years later. You know what I mean, though? But that's really, it's eye-opening. Civilians have no concept of how close to the line, particularly just staff writers and below-the-line people make on these shows.
That's right. I think one of the best examples is what's happened with Suits on Netflix. Here's a show that was made in Canada, basic cable, terrific show. In fact, Aaron Korsh went through the showrunner training program.
Oh, wow.
Lovely guy. And they did their 8 seasons. And then it got scooped up by Netflix, and they're making nothing. And not only are they not making anything, but Netflix is not compelled to reveal any figures. But the whole idea of divorcing performance from compensation is what the streamers have gotten away with. They've kind of gotten outside of the regulatory shield that's protected us for such a long time, so they can pretty much do whatever the market will bear.
Or keeping people in the dark as to how successful or popular their content or their product.
They won't tell
is.
showrunners
That's the
how well.
streamers. They never give the algorithms. They never give the compilation of figures. They're all like that.
This is naive. So this question is bonkers. So just smack me. But remember when United Artists started? It was Charlie Chaplin.
I wasn't around, but I have read about it.
You remember? You two college boys. Okay. So what about if the writers or the showrunners created their own streaming platform and just bypassed all of this other crazy bloated crap and just because we now have the technology to get content directly to folks who have any kind of television capabilities.
Yeah, in theory, it's not bonkers, but in reality, it's bonkers because of the money involved and all the things that you have to go through, all the steps. But the next best thing is, why don't we have a union and kind of stand together and say we won't stand for this? Mm-hmm. That's what's going on,
and that's what you're doing. Yes.
And what's counterintuitive to the producer's approach is that people connect to certain figures on a show. So sometimes, not all the time, it's always the writing. It's all about what's on the page. But sometimes a particular character or a particular person is part of the draw of the show, yet they have literally no power in making these decisions.
Yeah, I mean, that has changed a bit in recent times. I find that number one on the call sheet, the lead of the show, you used to have what would be pretty much vanity credits if you were an executive producer. That would mean, okay, we're going to give you the title, but you're really not invited into conversation. My last few experiences with bona fide stars like Kiefer Sutherland, Sandra Oh, Jodie Comer, they want a place at the table. They want to get their notes in. So that is changing somewhat, but we're all reduced to pawns in the game that's being played right now, no matter who you are, because the studios and the platforms hold the upper hand in these streaming areas. I will say that broadcast and legacy media has taken a beating in all sorts of ways, but I will say this, since I grew up in that system and owe a lot to that system, as do many of the people that are the leading streamer people. David Chase worked on Rockford Files. Matt Weiner worked in Half-Hour Comedy. Vince Gilligan worked on The X-Files, and on and on and on. We all came up through that system. Broadcast knew what it was about. They know what it's about. It's a business. There's discipline. There's calendars. There's budgets that you stick to. And there's a lot to be learned from that kind of discipline. And I've had experiences with streamers, and you're like in free fall. You're almost begging for some sort of discipline to make your show within that. I will say that both of the Amazon projects I worked on never got to air, but that's not unusual. The amount of money the blood on the floor, the money that's being wasted is incredible. And that's another thing about the strike, the disparity between the haves and the have-nots in many different ways. We're seeing it being played out across society right now.
Across society. I was going to make that parallel observation that, yes, it's like there are a lot of people with most of the money. But define for us the term showrunner, because we do not see it in the credits. So folks at home watching TV will be like, what? I don't see anyone with that title. It sounds like you're a gopher, the title. And so it's deceptive, but the showrunner is the guy. And you illustrate it beautifully in your book, the level of talent and responsibility required of this role. So describe what a showrunner is.
I mean, in essence, a showrunner makes all the creative decisions that go into the making of a television show in a conventional system, and certainly at the apex of it, the broadcast system. The first time I can find that the word was ever used in a public forum was a 1995 article about John Wells, who's a magnificent showrunner, when he was doing ER. And that article really went into all the responsibilities and abilities that John had. It's changing somewhat in today's context, depending on I see about 4 different business models that I won't go into, but the conventional broadcast model is on one end of the extreme. The streamer model, where you've got just to use as an extreme example, a feature director who has more say in the way the show is going to run than necessarily the showrunner, or the Marvel experience, where they have all of this IP, this intellectual property, and the studio is going to take the upper hand. And in some ways, it's very reminiscent of the Hollywood movie studios before the breakup of the antitrust in 48, where they held all the power. So there's a lot of convergence going on. There's a lot of disruption. But to answer your question, the showrunner, you're right. You'll never see it because it's not a formal title. It's an executive producer who has those functions. And I will say, among the cognoscenti, among people in the business and people who follow the business, there is no higher title than showrunner. There is no more aspirational goal than to be a showrunner, which can lead to problems because at its most extreme, at its apotheosis, people talk about it like the auteur theory in French cinema, which I think distorts the role of other people. And I think if you elevate the showrunner role beyond a certain point, you're giving too much credit to that individual. The best showrunners are the ones who spread praise and delegate well and recognize the value of collaboration.
We're going to talk about the rungs on the ladder below showrunner and how you work your way up to that later, because it's part of the great practical aspect of your book. But you mentioned John Wells, I think, was one of the producers of St. Elsewhere as well. Am I correct on that? Did he work on St. Elsewhere? Was he a writer? Was he?
John didn't do. Josh Brand and John Falsey did. They ended up creating then Northern Exposure. So that was their show. John worked on a couple of shows. China Beach was one that he worked on before ER exploded. And what's interesting is that he pitched ER with Spielberg and Michael Crichton, and then when the show took off, it was in John's lap to keep it going. Yeah. But he had some pretty powerful partners.
I just wanted to talk about NBC at that time, pre-ER and ER, but Grant Tinker was the head of the network then, and they did something that they don't do anymore. Grant Tinker had instinct about St. Elsewhere, and he had instinct about Hill Street Blues. And he had the guts and the intuition to allow them to grow. Even though they weren't enormously successful at the start in the ratings, he said, no, this is going to grow. It's got to find an audience. So 2, 3, 4 years in, the thing finally found an audience and had some momentum. Now, if you have a show that is soft for 2 or 3 episodes, you're gone.
Yeah, just a slight correction there. It was Brandon Tartikoff who was head at NBC at that time. Grant was head of MTM, Mary Tyler Moore. He was married to Mary Tyler Moore at the time. But you're absolutely right about every one of Grant's instincts. He allowed the writers to have their lead. His deal was, I'm not going to pay as much up front, but I'm going to give you more back end. I'm not going to let you do what you want, and I'll fight your battles for you. I think he went on to NBC then after that period of time. But Brandon Tartikoff, I understand it was his wife, Lily, who actually kept Hill Street on the air at the beginning because it was not doing anything in the ratings. And then it won every Emmy in sight, and they couldn't take it off the air at that point, and it found its way. But yeah, now if you underperform, you're gone. You're gone.
2 or 3 episodes. Yeah.
You have 6 rules that you lay out early in your book, and a lot of reading your book is advice for the specific job of showrunner. But a lot of it is just across the board life advice about being a good person, especially in leadership, the responsibility, sharing credit, all these wonderful qualities that make for just a satisfying life in general. So your 6 rules are for writing are love, read, write, go to the theater, read plays, get a liberal arts education, and have an unhappy childhood. And I think Fritz is right there. He's checking every box. So,
well, I'll tell you, the most surprising bit of advice to me. Well, you have the great bumper sticker of all time about careers and life and just the existential aspect of dealing with being on the planet, and that is show up. Shut up. I love that. That's such a good piece of advice. But what was surprising to me was you said a liberal arts education. Everybody who comes in as an intern at NBC when I worked there was so proud of having gone to film school or something like that. You're saying film school is not what you want to do. Liberal arts is better. Get a smattering of all aspects of life.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a minority point of view, but I still believe in the value of a liberal arts education. You don't know where that stuff is going to lead. But should you become a writer or any kind of creative individual, you need a well that you can go back to time and time again. And college and grad school is the time to fill that well. And my point is that there's plenty of time to learn, to get on-the-job training, to learn how the job is actually done. There's not a lot of time to read the people you want to read, to learn about subjects that you wouldn't otherwise necessarily be exposed to. And it's a leap of faith, but I believe that it certainly worked for me. And I understand the financial pressure on people, but I do think that, to use an overword phrase from Joseph Campbell, following your bliss, I do think that within reason, that's what college should be about. And I have a section on film school as well, which I call Dumbo's Feather, which has to do with gaining the confidence.
Yeah, tell the story of Dumbo's Feather.
Well, I ran into there was a terrific young woman who worked at Hill Street who was a production assistant. And by a lot of standards, people would have thought, you're well on your way into a business, you're into the business. And she wanted to write, and she asked me to write a letter to recommend her to USC, to grad school. And I said, well, why do you want to do that? And you're already involved in the business. And she said, I just feel I need it. I wouldn't know what I wouldn't know otherwise. I kind of just think I need it. And I said, oh, Dumbo's Feather. And clearly she didn't understand what I was talking about. And in the movie Dumbo, through a kind of a drunken escapade, Timothy the Mouse discovers that Dumbo can fly with his big ears. But Dumbo, when he wakes up, has no recollection of this. So Timothy, trying to help his friend, encourages him to believe it by giving him a feather that he holds in his trunk. And he says, this magic feather will help you fly. And so Dumbo then flies, and he believes that it's the feather that gives him that ability. And then at the climax of the film, when there's this big act in the big top, and Dumbo's supposed to jump from the top of the big top with Timothy on his back, the feather falls out of his trunk. And as he begins to plummet to the earth, Timothy's frantically yelling at him, you don't need the feather. You don't need the feather. You can fly. And Dumbo spreads his wings, and he flies. And it's a great moment. I remember as a kid being so thrilled by that. And that's what I felt Laurie's situation was, is that you don't need the feather, but as long as you believe you do, then it's important. But then when I asked her, I ran into her several years later, and I said, well, how did it go? She said, well, I learned more in my first 2 weeks working on a sitcom than I did in my 2 years at grad school, but I don't regret it. She said, I felt I needed it, and it was about self-confidence, and I don't think there's any way to underestimate that.
Plus, you collaborate on projects when you're in film school and stuff, so you have to learn that aspect of the business too. But before you wrote for TV, you were a print journalist.
That's right.
You were a correspondent for Time magazine.
Right.
So did the writing for print, and that's like the news business, who, what, where, when, and why kind of writing, how did that translate into dialogue writing and character writing and plot writing? I mean, were you able to, except for you have to learn how to use an economy of words.
Right.
But what about the two writing styles?
Well, it's interesting. I think that the impact of group journalism, which is what Time practiced at that time, you had a lot of correspondents in the field who would write long files that were then cut down by a writer in New York and then top edited by a senior editor. To me, it was the process of doing a lot in a little bit of time that Time had a great impact on me. Working in an atmosphere of excellence with great deadline pressure, that's what translated to TV. I felt immediately at home. I said, I know what this is about. The actual writing style, I didn't find as much translation, but the getting outside of the office, being used to the way I looked at journalism that way, especially being a Time correspondent, is you're constantly being dropped behind enemy lines and trying to figure out what's going on. You'd go from city to city to city and come home with the story. That was very exciting, and I feel we have to do the same thing with episodes. And
it's storytelling,
yeah,
in a different venue.
So it does have that in common. But the lessons, what's stranger, when people say, oh, you were a journalist, how did you become a writer in television? Well, it's stranger is how I became a journalist, because I spent all my time in high school in theater. My high school drama teacher was by far my biggest single influence. When I went to college, I did a lot of directing, and then I studied playwriting. Robert Anderson, the playwright who wrote Tea and Sympathy and I Never Sang for My Father, was a great teacher of mine my senior year. So how did I get to be a journalist was more because I wanted to make a living and see if I could make a living writing. And again, this goes back to liberal arts education. I was a history and literature major. I wrote my thesis on American detective fiction because that was a subject that interested me, and had a great time doing that. And when it came time to submit a piece of work to be considered as a journalist, I used that as my writing sample, and it just turned out that at Fairchild Publications, the group that publishes women's wear and a bunch of other stuff, the editor in charge of their news service was a huge mystery fan. So he loved it. He hired me. I was a cub reporter in Washington, D.C. 3 months later, they asked if I would become bureau chief of a one-man bureau in Miami. And I asked him, I said, do you think I'm qualified? And they turned red. They said, do you think we'd offer to if you weren't qualified? I learned a very important lesson, never complain, never explain, right? And so I did that. And then that led to time through a series of misadventures.
Well, you contend there's a paradox to the showrunner. So you contend that the qualities present in most writers, loner, brooding, insecure, selfish, paranoid, impulsive, indecisive, are the polar opposite of those required of a showrunner, which would be gregarious, congenial, secure, generous, trusting, diplomatic, and decisive. And I have found that this is true across the board in any field, that the skills and assets that allow one to excel individually do not overlap with leadership potential. So great leaders are gifted and inclusive. Elaborate.
Yeah, I think that the qualities that often make good writers are diametrically opposed to that which makes good leaders, which is to say you can't cross. There are certain writers, though, for whom those qualities of leadership just are very much harder to obtain or to execute. And some of them, by dint of their writing, actually become showrunners and never really become terrific managers. And as long as the writing keeps them on top, that's fine. But as soon as there's a drop of blood in the water, they're gone. Whereas, and John Wells talks about this when we do the showrunner training program. He explains that, look, most shows fail. When we're talking about also the broadcast universe, most shows fail. But if you've done a good job of running it, you're going to get another shot because people say, hey, we liked working with Fritz, and let's work together again. You can have a moderate success, and if you treat people poorly, you're not going to get that shot, or people aren't going to be as inclined to give you that shot. And so that's some of the stuff that we try to emphasize in the showrunner program. But I do think that because of the way we become writers, and everybody comes to it by a different method, but we're very, very focused on ourselves and very focused on our perceptions, and that's really important. And if you have the instinct for leadership at all, by opening a few books to you, by opening some windows on what it takes to be a good manager, by talking about Maslow and other principles of management and human behavior, if you've got the instinct for it, I think you just gobble it up. And what I say in the showrunner program is this is not intended to be the last word on show running. It's intended to be the first word. The education never stops.
Well, you talk about many ways to crack the nut to get into show business and the writing area. And one of the ways, which sort of is an easier way to attract attention to your talent, is to write a spec script. And your first one that got you in the door was the spec script for Remington Steele.
Right.
But the interesting twist is it was one line in your Remington Steele script that attracted them to you. Describe that, because it's so funny. It's just the way fate works, that your success may come from a place you're not expecting it.
I think that's right. I think that writing spec scripts, one of the hardest things about script writing is structure, and I talk about that in the book. But your sensibility, your voice, that can't be fake. That's something that you bring to it. So I wrote this spec script, and I don't even remember what most of the plot was, but it had an opening of a costume party where Remington and Laura had been hired to look out for a jewel thief. And so Remington had picked the costumes, and he shows up as Sherlock Holmes, and he's got Laura, played by Stephanie Zimbalist, the lovely Stephanie Zimbalist, in a bunny outfit, looking like a rabbit, not like a Playboy bunny. And it turns out that the jewel thief, there's very much a Hitchcockian type of video that somebody's been hitting these Beverly Hills parties. He showing up as a carrot, and he steals a diamond necklace or something, and immediately Remington turns to Laura, dressed as a bunny, and says, "Stop that carrot." And so pretty terrible. But the guy who created Remington Steele, Michael Gleason, he loved it, and he said, "I had to meet the person who wrote that line." And so we had a very good meeting, and he said, "I'd like to buy that scene." And so my first money in show business was $300 under the table for him to buy that scene, and he grafted it onto a Southern California history costume party, and the line became, "Stop that, Zorro." I didn't care. I mean, he also said...
You were a pro at that point.
He said, that's right, but I couldn't tell the guild about that money. It was totally under the table. But he said if the show came back for a second season, I would get a script. And he was good to his word, and the show was renewed. I got a script, and like Satchel Paige, I just didn't look back.
Awesome. So you have some great visual aids in your book, and one of them is I think it's called A Day in the Life, and it's like this chart that illustrates how many episodes in the season a showrunner could be needing to focus on any given day. Talk more about that. The multitasking. If you're not a multitasker, maybe showrunner isn't the best job for you.
I agree, and certainly if you're working under more of a broadcast or basic cable, or for lack of a better word, 13-episode environment, because that model was you were writing scripts while you were already in production. So you begin by writing as many scripts as you can before the cameras start to roll, but then you have to keep writing, especially with a 22-episode season. The general rule was that you would want to have 4 or 5 scripts in some form of completion, and then you just got to keep going. The great radio pundit Fred Allen, he called his autobiography "Treadmill to Oblivion," and that's kind of what it felt like when you were working on these 22-episode series. So the illustration in the book, and it goes back to it's interesting how much the business has changed since the beginning of the showrunner training program, which was 19 years ago. But over half the class was white guys working in broadcast. For the last 5 years, over half the class have been women. The last 2 years, it's been 2/3 women, and broadcast is no longer the dominant form. Although it's still, it's not going away anytime soon. But when the program began, I think I probably predicated a lot of the curriculum on this is the second year of a 22-episode show, and so that's what that illustration is about. You're on like episode 10 of your season, and if you chart through it, and it's exaggerated, but I think that particular showrunner was involved with 8 different episodes in the course of the day. There's the show that's shooting. There's the show that the script that you're trying to rewrite. There's the outline of the show that you're working on in the future. And then there's other shows that you have to think about coming up. Then there's the cut that you now have to deliver to the studio. There's another cut that you have to deliver to the network, which is at a later stage of development. Then there's a cut that's been locked. It's done. All the edits are done, and you have to sit with the composer and spot the music. Now, all that is thrilling and exciting, but taking it all at once. There's a showrunner, Liz Friedman, who went through the showrunner program, and she said, after her first job, she said, showrunning is like being beaten to death with your own dreams. And that's how it can feel. But it's interesting because that illustration. Like I said, it's a bit exaggerated, but it reminds me when I worked on Hill Street, we had a great team of second ADs and great extras, and they would constantly be sending these background people through. When we were in Hill Street Station, you would see this blizzard of activity, constantly things in motion. And I haven't been a reporter and haven't been in a lot of police precincts, including New York and San Francisco. Hill Street on its slowest day was more frantic than New York on its most frantic day. And yet I'd hear from cops that say that's exactly the way it is. And I'd say, no, that's not the way it is. That's the way it feels. And that's our job as artists, is that's the way it feels. And so that illustration, even if it's not literally the way a person's day could go, although you can talk to showrunners and they'll say, yeah, there have been days like that, it always feels that way.
When you were working on Designated Survivor, did you notice the parallels between being the president all of a sudden and having your script picked up and you're the showrunner all of a sudden? Every emergency is on your desk.
Well, I felt more like the Designated Survivor because I was brought in on episode 11. They'd already fired 2 showrunners on that show.
Oh, you were the actual Designated Survivor of Designated Survivor.
That's a great thing you talk about in the book, is coming into a show that is already established. Even worse, coming into a show that's failing and they're hiring you. You're like, you've got stage 3 pancreatic cancer. You're bringing you in to be the new oncologist. But I mean, what a hard position for somebody to be in.
It is if you're not prepared to do it. But rather than oncology, I'd say it's more like triage, like a highway scene where there's been a smash up.
You're
And
bleeding out.
yeah, and so you got to decide immediately who can be saved, who can't be saved. And you've got to prioritize your patients. Who's got a pulse, who doesn't have a pulse,
All right.
arterial bleeding, and you begin to prioritize. And it's that way with the scripts. When I came on to Army Wives, a great show, but they had fired the showrunner after one episode. They had no episodes, and they wanted to be back up in 10 days. By that point in my career, based largely on the fact that I loved the show. I saw and I had a chance to see the pilot. It had been cast. I give full marks to whoever did the casting and to Catherine Fouché, who created the show. But I saw what it was. I saw what it could be. And I thought, okay, I don't know if I can do this, but I don't think there's anybody better equipped to do it. There may be people equally well equipped to do this, but I feel I want to do this. And what's the worst that can happen? It'll be over in 4 months. And
you left and came back.
well, that was a different story. We kind of brought the show back to health, and Catherine, who had been really traumatized by the first stretch, was feeling very strongly now about how she wanted to take the show, where she wanted to take the show. And what I told her when I came in was that, look, this is your show. I don't want to take it away from you. I just want to put it on its feet. And so a few months later, when it was the #1 show on Lifetime and people were really loving it, I wasn't going to change my tune. I actually went to the folks at the executives at Lifetime, who I really respected, and I said, look, Catherine wants to take it in this direction. Her idea for a finale is not my idea for a finale. I think it's a mistake, but I also think it's her show. And if I were you, I'd go with her. And they said, we agree. And we left on very good terms. And I actually had arranged an opportunity to teach at Harvard in the next year. So I went to do that. And while I was doing that, two things happened. The Guild went on strike. This was 2007, 2008. So I was actually teaching in Cambridge when the strike happened. And they went through 3 showrunners. They fired Catherine pretty early into the season. They fired 2 other showrunners. I don't know much about the details. I didn't care. But they asked me to come back at the end of that. And I looked at what they had done, and I said, look, Joanne Alfano had taken over the network, and I love Joanne. I thought she was very bright. And I said, look, I've looked at all the episodes. This is what I think the mistakes are. This is what I would do to change it. And if you don't agree with me, don't hire me, because that's the only way I know how to get the show back on its feet. She took a second, and then she said, when can you begin? And so we got along really well for the next 5 years. And then she was shifted out of that job, and they canceled it. So
You described the pressure of a showrunner through the season. Let's talk about a description of the work environment for the writer. Say you have a 22-episode season, and talk about the writer's environment. How much time is in the room? How many scripts in that 22 season is one writer responsible for? Is all the writing teamwork? Is it a single writer and then the team fixes it toward the end? Describe how it works.
Those are excellent questions, and there's not one answer that will, suit. Each show does certain things in unique ways, and I got to say that half hour is different than 1 hour, and because half hour traditionally the room writes pretty much everything, and then somebody's designated to write up the script. And you could have contributed as writer A 80% to writer B's script, but writer B writes it up, gets his name on it or her name on it, and then the same thing might happen next week. It's a little different in my experience in 1 hour. If you have 5 writers to do 13 episodes, I always try to be as equitable as I can and make sure that each writer, well, let's take a 22-episode season. Let's say 6 writers. Everybody should do 2 or 3. I mean, if they're not proven qualities, you have to be somewhat flexible and say, can I give this person more responsibility? But granted that people are working out, everybody's in the room to help break stories. Before production begins, what I call the honeymoon period, everybody's in the room. When people break off to write their outlines or write their scripts, suddenly the room is depopulated. And so if you have a 6-person staff, you could suddenly find yourself with 2 or 3 other people, which is why I suggest in the book that don't just assign your scripts in seniority, or you'll find yourself left in the room with your youngest and least experienced people. You want to hopscotch around a bit. But generally speaking, and again, it has to do with leadership and involvement, you want everybody to buy into every episode. And something I picked up from John Wells is when an outline comes back from the writer and I've gone over it, we go over it in the room and everybody weighs in. Everybody's expected to have read the script, and then we go through it page by page, or the outline, and the same thing for a script. So, people they know the rules. They have to be respectful. They can't criticize without making a suggestion, but But I'll be Judge Judy about that. They'll say, I think this, and I'm going to say, yeah, I think that's a pretty good idea. I'll turn to the writer. I say, what do you think? And if she says, yeah, I could do that, fine. Or I might say, yeah, I hear you, overruled, let's move on, and we just keep going. So you try to get buy-in. You try to give as much individual responsibility as possible. As you can imagine, if there's 6 people on staff in 22 episodes and somebody's doing 6 and somebody's doing 2, there's got to be an explanation. And sometimes there is. I mean, if somebody can't do it.
And you talk about this relatively new phenomenon, which apparently has come up in the current negotiations, which is the mini room.
Yeah.
What is that?
It's a terrible term for one thing. It makes it sound like mini me. It's small. It means that the room, to me, the basic description is the room breaks up before production. And mini room's been used to cover a host of sins. I've heard people hired for 2 to 3 people hired for a week to come up with ideas for a creator to pitch.
So mini is a time period.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, and it's not even so much weeks. You could have 20 weeks in a mini room. So what it means is it's not an extended room that runs through production.
So is that a cost-cutting maneuver, or what is that? It seems counter to making the show as good as it could possibly be.
I agree. It has, at its trying to be charitable, the film model, and I've talked about how there's been some convergence of the old movie studio model, is if you're only going to do 6 hours or 8 hours, and the British do things this way. When I worked on Killing Eve, that was my first exposure to this, is that you do it in blocks of 2, you do what's called crossboarding, so that instead of just doing each episode individually, you take a look at 2 episodes, and so you try to economize. If we have 3 scenes in the studio and 2 occur in one script and 1 in the next script, you shoot all those scenes at one time, so you don't have to come back and set up lights and do the company move and all of that. So there's cost-saving measures to getting scripts done in advance and then boarding the whole thing and economizing because you have more time to figure out how you're going to shoot it. The problem is that scripts are never done. They'd say, okay, turn in your 6 scripts or your 8 scripts, and then go away. And now we turn over to the line producer and the director and the actors, and suddenly notes are coming in. And who's left to do those notes? It's usually just the one showrunner. That's the way it began to be abused. And it was way too much work to be done by one person. But the mini room, is it a cost-cutting measure? Like I said, to be charitable, it was a way to allow crossboarding and economizing in production. But in reality, the idea that you don't want to carry writers through and let them observe the process, even if you don't necessarily strictly need to write through production, that to me is penny wise and pound foolish, because you're not bringing up the next generation of showrunners, of writer producers. You are cutting off their apprenticeship, and it really is penny wise and pound foolish. And like I said, the idea that when the mini room is over, the writing is over, is just not so.
Yeah. You talked about Killing Eve, which was great. Sleeper hit, Sandra Oh. Lots of people loved it. It just appeared out of nowhere. And you talked for a few sentences about the difference in the British production standards in America. What's the difference in the way an hour is produced in Britain than an hour produced here?
The fundamental difference is that the lead writer there is referred to as the lead writer, not as the showrunner, and is no more or less powerful than like the head of the camera department. You're the head of the writing department. The director typically and the studio people have more authority than the lead writer does once the scripts are delivered. Another way of looking at it, and this is true not just in the UK, but I've done a fair amount of teaching and seminar leading abroad, is that in the United States, and largely because of the force of the Writers Guild, which you can't underestimate, the writer is perceived as both labor and management. Outside of the United States, writers are seen as labor only. And the battle that I've talked about with many writer-producers in the UK and elsewhere is how they can be perceived with any respect as more than strictly labor. They want their place at the table, but as one writer, Emma Frost, put it, who went through the showrunner program, she's a wonderful British writer, once you turn in the script, they pat you on the head and say, you go back to the sandbox and the adults will take it from here. And that really is there's a classicism, a classic, in England, there's a class nature to it that certainly grew out of the BBC that pertains to that. But there's definitely a paternalistic attitude, but it's hardwired into the culture. And so to try to break that and be perceived as somebody, well, you're the writer. Why should you have anything to say about how we're actually producing?
Is there a guild for writers over there?
There is, but it's not as strong. And after Thatcher, the union movement in England was weakened pretty much across the board. But wonderful people work at the Guild, and we actually, Emma and I and Jed Mercurio, the guy who did Bodyguard and Line of Duty, we did a seminar for the British Writers Guild. So lovely people, but a very different culture. In fact, some of the people there, one of the things I've said about the writers there, because of the British system, it's not unusual to find a British television writer who just came off of writing a radio play and earlier that year had written a legitimate play, had written a film, had done a piece of journalism. I mean, they have to scramble to stay alive. And because of that, the originality, the initiative is just remarkable. But the flip side is they're not used to the team play that we do in the United States in writing, so that they kind of got the proud but poor thing. So when you say you're in a room now and you're going to share your idea with Lauren, well, why should I share my idea with Lauren? so there was some acculturation that had to go on.
Yeah, they have a survival mechanism or instinct that has driven them. But I have a question that you may not know the answer to, but I have recently been saying that our best American actors are British. But you don't see them calling for our guys when they need a British accent. So why is this happening?
That's been an issue, I think, for a while. And it's not just British. It's South African, it's Australian, it's New Zealand. And, the answer I heard, and there's no real good explanation for it, is because they project a certain masculinity and a certain maleness that directors and casting directors were not finding in the American pool.
Do not say that to Steve Bannon.
Right.
This is going to be a problem. Oh my God.
I mean, I'm not
You're
supporting
already tanning their testicles.
But whether there's any truth to that or not, let's put the most positive to them. There's just some great actors coming out of those places.
Yes,
Well, do they teach dialects better than we do?
I mean, some of these, like the guy from Succession.
Oh, wonderful guy.
Do you know which guy I'm talking about? I had no idea he was a Brit. And then I watched him on BritBox, on one of the 5,000 shows on BritBox, and he's a Brit. And I thought there is no modicum of an indication that he's a Brit in his Succession performance. Right. It just looks like a pain-in-the-ass American guy.
And why am I blanking on the name of the woman who played the sister in that
Yeah,
group?
she's Australian.
Right.
Oh, my God. And there's no hint. That's a skill.
Yeah, I mean, so they're very skilled and they do train. And, I think that the story I always liked was on Marathon Man when Dustin Hoffman had to play the scene where he was sleepless and exhausted and so he deprived himself of sleep. And apparently Olivier was supposed to have said to him, "Young man, why don't you try acting?" And that's probably an apocryphal story, but it does represent a little bit of difference. And I even saw that difference in Killing Eve. I mean, Jodie Comer and Sandra Oh are fantastic actresses, actors, I guess we're supposed to say these days, actors. And they have very different approaches, and they're both legitimate. But it was really interesting to watch the different approach. And Sandra is definitely more method, and Jodie was. Something else. Jodie's a phenomenon. I mean, I think she's a one-off. So I don't want to put her in any camp. But anyway, it was fascinating to watch the two of them.
So let's talk about the cubicle farm that exists between writers and showrunners. On Remington Steele, you went from writer to story editor to executive story editor to supervising producer. So what are those steps, and describe the differences in their jobs?
Well, the point I try to make overall in the book is that most titles short of showrunner, regardless of what the title says, you're doing the same job, which is writing and contributing in the room. And the seniority may have something to say about who gets to speak first and loudest in the room. But in terms of division of labor, if a hierarchical chart usually looks like a pyramid, and you think that the showrunner's at the apex of that, and then it kind of goes down through the ranks, or very much like the military. I've often found on shows, and I'm not endorsing this, but the reality is, and I think writers out there would agree, is that the actual chart looks more like a lollipop on a stick. I mean, the disc is there's the showrunner, and then there's this the horizon that the stick is stuck into, and everybody else is doing somewhat the same thing. I think the most legitimate distinction is the number two. Most every showrunner is going to designate somebody to take over the writer's room when the showrunner can't be there. And that is a genuine responsibility. that's important.
What's the title of that person?
Probably George. I mean, it could be a co-executive producer. It could be a supervising producer. One of the things about, I think, a really well-run writer's room is that it's a meritocracy. And I think one of the problems that people make is I always am using the military and sports as my analogies in this business. And the problem with, I think, a lot of first-timers is they think that assembling a show is like putting together a military platoon. You got a captain, you got a lieutenant, you're going to have several sergeants, you're going to have then your corporals and your privates. And it's a nice theory, it just doesn't work, because to mix the analogies, it's more like sandlot baseball. You show up, you say, who's available? Okay, and then you make your team depending on who's available. Or if it's like are you going to, it's so, okay, we have nobody who can hit homers, we're going to play small ball. We're going to do it that way. Or whatever, you play to the available talent. And I think that's also, staying with that analogy, Moneyball is a really important concept. You want to get the biggest bang for the buck. And I would rather have 2 or 3 younger writers who are cheap and eager and have great potential than one writer who I haven't worked with who's experienced and has a higher price tag and is just kind of slumming. I'm doing it because I couldn't get any other work. Just to characterize things. So there is, on the best shows, and it's the John Wells method, and a lot of people practice it. Greg Daniels on the half-hour side, Mike Schur, who's a Greg Daniels devotee, and the thing is, the nice thing is that good people inspire schools of protégés, and they will let individuals produce their own episode. Meaning, if you were on my show, if it's your script, you get to participate in the casting process. You get to show up for the production meetings. If we're on location, you get to show up on location for at least a few of those days. I have some kind of a philosophical disagreement with some people about how important it is to have the writer on set. I think it's very important for the writer. I hope it's not too important for the show, because if it is, what's the director doing? But again, that's part of a different discussion. But then also you sit in on post. You see all the cuts. You go to the mix, and so you get a very dimensional view of your own episode. And then beyond that, I also like to deputize people. Like my wife tells me I'm no good with wardrobe, and so I always have to find somebody. I'll be watching a show. I get so into the story that I'm watching it, and my wife will suddenly say, "What is she wearing?" and I'll say, "What?" And she'll look at it, and oh, you're right, but I won't notice. So I have to make sure somebody on staff is paying attention to wardrobe, and I do the same thing with other things as well. So there is, there is division of labor, there is apprenticeship being offered. But I think a lot of people would say when push comes to shove, we're all being paid. If you're beneath the showrunner, you're all being paid to write scripts. That's your number one responsibility.
Mm-hmm. Now, you have in your book the 12 Ps. I don't know if you can see my clipboard, but let's go through these. I don't know how you did this, and we're so loyal to one letter of the alphabet, but go ahead and describe what these roles are that a showrunner is required to embody.
Sure. Well, as a teaching device, I found that this was a good way to kind of talk about another way of describing the job. Producer. Up to this point, you've had this in your title, but you might not have done any actual producing. One of the things we found with people coming up to the showrunner training program today, and you have to be at a certain level. It's a selective master class thing. We get about 190 applicants for 30 spots every year. And we get very talented, accomplished people, but they say, yeah, I'm a co-executive producer. I've never sat in on the edit of an episode. So anyway, you might have had that title, but now you're expected to know what a producer does in television. You're expected to know all phases of production, pre-production, shooting, and post. And if you don't know those things, you've got to find a way to learn. And like anything else in the business, certain things you'll do well. Again, going back to sports, like in soccer, there's only about 4 or 5 moves in soccer that you need to know as an offensive player. You only really need to do 1 or 2 really well, and if you can do it at speed under pressure, you'll be successful. As a showrunner, there's a couple things you may do really well, and then you've got to delegate and find people who can do the other things well. So that's producer. Problem solver. Again, it goes back to what we were saying about why writers aren't necessarily well suited to be managers. One of the keys of being a manager is trying to decide when things come across your field of vision, is this a problem? Is this a problem that rises to my level of attention? If it does, how urgent is it? What are my options? and what am I going to decide to do? That's just a whole way of thinking that writers only think about solving problems in terms of scripts. And now you got to be thinking about it on a broader scale. You're a potentate, which means you have power. That was a funny way to keep the P alive. but as Peter Parker learned, with great power comes great responsibility. And when you get your first show, you're going to discover you have more friends than you ever remembered you had before, because people want work. And not only do they want work, you'll get calls with people that you might have worked with on a show several years ago who said, my guild insurance is going to run out unless I get another script. Can you give me a script? These are real world issues, and you have to be prepared to put on that cloak and not shrink from it. You have to make decisions. So having the power is great, and it's also, it can be burdensome. You're a professor. You'll think because you wrote a pilot that got picked up that everybody sees it the same way you do. And you'll discover to your disappointment that that's not necessarily so. You've got to show them how you want them to write your show. And again, that's a matter of stepping up and realizing I don't have to say I'm the best writer in the world, but I was hired because of the script I wrote. This is the sensibility that I have to reflect. And as long as you want to work here, you got to do things that reflect my sensibility or things that pass my filter. And again, so that's another step up in terms of assuming responsibility. And also, if you enjoy teaching and you have people who are open to it, that's another aspect. You're a psychologist. That's a very sneaky P. But, motivating people is, again, something that writers haven't really thought about terribly much. But some people need to be cajoled. Other people need to be nurtured. Other people need to be kicked in the butt. It depends. And you also got to think several steps ahead. If I do this, what's likely to happen? And be making little decision trees in your head. You're a politician in the best sense. Politics is the art of compromise. When you have any kind of managerial position involving money and power, you know that you can't win every battle. And so you have to decide which battles are worth fighting, which hill you want to die on, and you don't want to spend all that currency too soon. But you've got to be a diplomat, and you've got to be moving well between different constituencies. And if you just look at executives as the enemy, you're not going to get terribly far. You're a paradigm in that how you behave sets the example for how you want that show to run. And a lot of what I learned about leadership was when I was coaching 8-year-olds in soccer. And I didn't learn it from coaching the 8-year-olds. I learned it from trying to manage their parents.
Yes.
And so, your daughter, a ball goes across the goal mouth. Your daughter takes a swing at it and misses and falls down. It would have been an easy tap in. You have a choice. You can throw down your clipboard and rip off your headphones and curse, or you can say, unlucky, we'll do better next time. And how you behave then models for your parents how you expect them to behave. And it's the same thing on a writing staff. You're a parent. This is really important. If you create a show, you're literally the parent of everything that follows. If you take over a show, as I have many times, you're a step parent, and you have to recognize what the differences are, but you're still a parent. And being a parent isn't the same thing as being a friend. You hope that your kids are friendly with you down the line, but that's not your primary job. Your primary job is to instill all the qualities you want them to have. You can love them. You don't always have to like them as much in the moment, but you have to also constantly be reading the patient, not the chart. You want to be making sure that you're being firm when you need to be firm and compassionate when you need to be compassionate. And if you don't want to be a parent, if you say, I didn't take this job in any way to be a parent, you're still a parent. You're just a dysfunctional parent. And if you and if you look at what happens on shows where people ignore this responsibility, it's like what happens in a dysfunctional family. Some kids will want to take authority. Some kids will just withdraw. And so it's an important aspect of it. You're a protector in that your first obligation to your writing staff and to your actors and to everyone else is to create a safe environment. In the writer's room, that's an emotionally safe environment and a creatively safe environment. With the cast, it's the same. With the crew, it takes on a more physical dimension. We've seen problems on set, and we've seen if you're keeping people late and asking people to work overtime and then they have to drive 30 miles back home, as they often do on location shows, you're endangering their health, and you have to do what's best for your group. You're a priest in that you will hear things from certain people that you never expected to hear. They will come to you to tell you things if you've gained their trust. And you don't want to take on more than your bandwidth can allow. But within reason, that to me is a privilege when you're in charge. And there's telling you things in confidence. If you see a writer who's not been performing well lately and you invite them in the office and you say, hey, Joe, what's going on? You might be surprised what you hear. And you have to be willing to listen. In certain cases, and I've had this with certain actors, where the problem goes beyond anything I can solve. If it involves any kind of addictive behavior or abusive behavior, then you got to help them get the help they need. You've got to get the studio involved. But in many cases, you just have to be a decent listening human being. And then at the end, you're a person. I mean, we've described that it's an impossible job to do well 24/7, and you got to have some compassion for yourself. I think Pauline Kael said, if you want to get a friend in this business, get a dog. But I think we all need people on the outside to keep us balanced, and you need to do what you need to do to maintain your mental and physical health, and that's no small matter. And I think one of the impacts of one of the aspects of more women being involved as showrunners is they've emphasized this to a large degree, the work-life balance. It's very important to them that the environment be more humane than the one that they were brought up in, and I applaud that.
That's so interesting. Well, I got to tell you, if you have any aspirations to writing for television, the thing I loved about your book was it wasn't looking through the sepia tone lens of how beautiful television was and is now. It's very practical, and I love that you started the book out with your personal experiences and then got to the primer, the instructional part in the end, and it's really it was a fun read. And you have great little catchphrases that I will never forget. One is show up, shut up, which I can't wait to tell my kids when I get home tonight. The other one is Jeff Bezos, the Stalin of streaming. Describe that description.
Well, it's just because Amazon has just such unlimited resources that just like Stalin could afford to throw a lot of troops at the front line and not be concerned about the carnage, Amazon can just throw millions, literally millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars at the wall until something sticks. And so that asymmetry we talked about earlier, they have the ability to do that. I happen to know some folks who worked on Citadel, the second most expensive show in Amazon's history. And the stories I heard, which I can't repeat because they were told to me in confidence, but it would curl your hair. And it's obscene also. It's obscene the amount of money that just patently was wasted. You'll never see it. Stuff was shot, never used. And it's really a shame, especially
It seems like we're reaching critical mass with the number of streaming services, too. The herd has to be thinned soon, don't you think so?
Absolutely. Well, it's funny. John Landgraf Jr., who had coined the phrase peak TV, which was like 5 or 6 years ago at least, he felt he was describing a phenomenon that would then decline. It peaked. That's why he said it. And instead of peaking, instead of declining, it just kept peaking.
It
and so
metastasized.
That's a good way of putting it.
I think the streaming, it has that addictive nature that, we first experienced with our phones where, you could be talking to someone very interesting and be physically trying to suppress the urge to look at your phone. So it definitely has an addictive power. And I think the ability to watch the next episode and the next episode keeps peak at peak.
Right. It also keeps them, it insulates them. The subscription model, as opposed to the broadcast model, means as long as there's one thing you want to watch, you're going to keep watching and you're going to keep your subscription up. Whereas, the networks are able to say, well, that show didn't work and that show didn't work. But I think that I lost my thread.
At one point, Johnny came on. Fritz told you the weather, then Johnny came on, and then it's time to go to bed.
Right.
You know what I mean? But TV never ends.
Right.
There's no reason to go to bed.
Well, I know what I was going to say is that going into this past year, it was estimated there were as many as 600 scripted shows being written for the American audience. And I remember we have a keynote address every year for the beginning of the showrunner training program, and Peter Roth from Warner Brothers gave it several years. He was great, and I'd worked with him at Fox. And this goes back many years now. He said, I used to make a point of watching at least one episode of every show that was on the air. Now think about doing that today.
Oh, no.
And by the way, I had to describe in the book, for the benefit of readers who were born after the Reagan administration, what TV Guide is. Because
yes, that was
that was great.
It was possible that you could describe everything that was on there. But I was talking to John Wells and others, and if we're at a peak of around 600 now, some people are predicting that very quickly it's going to be 300. scripted series. Now, I expected that we would have seen the decline rather slowly, but I think between the strike and also what's now been revealed to be this lemming behavior of all these people chasing Netflix off a cliff. I mean, that used to be seen as, oh, that's the way up the mountain, that's the way to Mount Sinai, and now it looks like, that's the way into the Red Sea with the waters coming in after you.
Wow.
I remember having a discussion with my boss about how streaming was going to be in the future. And he said that the show that flipped the script on streaming was House of Cards.
That's correct. Yeah.
And he said the reason why is it was the first time that that the business model changed. That is, Netflix did a purchase for, I don't know how many episodes they did, 10 or 12 episodes, and they got paid for their episodes. So ratings had nothing to do with it. Views had nothing to do with it. The production company got their pay up front. There was no downside to any of it. Now it was just Netflix trying to sustain their viewership.
Well, the interesting thing about that is that after the success of that show, Netflix learned a lesson. They produce their own shows now. They didn't produce that show. They had to pay the company for that. And did you remember when that came on the air? Do you know how long it's been since streaming started?
No.
2013. It's only been 10 years, and look at what's happened to the business in 10 years.
So much feels longer now.
Yeah, so not only did it have an impact on consumer behavior and the whole business model, but from my perspective, there's another big cultural difference, is that when you read about that show, Bo Willimon, the playwright, had written it, and he got his fair amount of press. But so did David Fincher. I mean, so again, what goes hand in hand with that phenomenon is suddenly the director and the writer are getting equal billing.
More like in film.
Yeah, and what happened with
Kevin Spacey.
the detective, what was the thing that was on HBO?
Michael Chiklis?
Yeah, no.
The Shield?
No, not The Shield. It was on HBO, the...
True Detective?
True Detective.
Yeah.
That was the one. Again, the director of that first season, Corey Fukunaga, or however you pronounce his name, who went on to do a Bond film, he got tremendous press. And then the next year, same writer, who's a terrific writer, but the show did not do as well. And
that was all about casting, that show, was it?
Well, that had a lot to do with it, but it's also a little bit like the Brady-Belichick argument. I mean, so Brady leaves the Patriots, and suddenly Brady keeps winning, and Belichick doesn't. So the question was, in that particular pairing, well, gee, the director's not there, now the show's not doing so well. So the perception is, I guess we know where the difference is. I don't think it's that simple at all.
No,
I think
it's
hard.
a different storyline entirely.
Yeah, it was, and it's very hard to replicate. And I think that
But the pairing on that show really had to be right, I thought.
Yeah, I mean, that first season was remarkable.
Yeah,
and it's very hard to replicate that sort of thing.
Right. It's like genie in a bottle, or magic. Yeah, whatever the phrase is, it's like that. Lightning in a bottle. Something you don't have often. It's like that. So you, how did it feel to lay it all out for all of us? Did it help you better understand what you do, to synthesize it and present it?
Yes, and it still does. I mean, I still go back. Oh, yeah, that's right. To me, the showrunner training program and teaching at USC, I teach in the Stark program, and doing. I've worked with the Film Institute of Cologne, doing some seminars there, and I've talked to other people. Each one of these educational experiences, and I tell people this, I get as much back from it as I put into it. But writing it, I mean, I was taking notes since 2014 on this, and sometimes it would be the equivalent of a digital scrap of paper that just had 3 lines on it. In fact, I just came across one that I forgot to put in the book. Was talking about judo. I often think that in terms of dealing with executives, that rather than trying to, if you try to box somebody, one of you is going to go down if you stop. But in dealing with it, it's like judo. You want to take somebody's momentum and put it in a place that works for you. And that's one of those things that I just wrote down in a stream of consciousness, and I don't think it showed up in the book. It'll show up in the next one. But so it was consolidating a lot of these things, and I really enjoyed it much more than I anticipated.
So when you taught at Harvard and you're teaching at USC now, the marketplace kind of dictates the tastes of the youth. What are kids writing? What are kids drawn to? What style?
That's a great question. The Peter Stark program strictly technically is for producers. It's the Peter Stark producing problem. But a number of them want to write and or direct in some capacity. And even if they don't, my attitude is you need to understand how to think like a writer so you can give notes that are writer friendly. So I give them some very clear assignments that are broken down. I'm not asking them to write scripts based on what's in their head. I'm giving them assignments like I talk about. I use a book written by Alan Armour, who was a great teacher at Cal State Northridge, and he wrote a wonderful book called Screenwriting, Television, and Writing the Screenplay, Television, and Film, I think, and full of practical advice because he actually taught, whereas opposed to a lot of writing books are written by people who've never taught. They just needed to write a book. And so if you define a story as a person with a problem, we begin the class by saying, okay, here's 3 different types of people. Pick one of them and find a problem for that person. And then here's 3 different problems. Find a character to meet one of those problems. And that's the beginning of trying to think like a professional writer, in my opinion, because that's what you do all the time. So I can't say I always look at what they're reading and what they're listening to, and I do my own little survey of them at the beginning so I get a sense of where they're coming from. And the disparity of interest is remarkable. Out of a class of 24, and they're from around the world, you're lucky if you see the same shows, films, music show up on more than 2 or 3 people's things. But what's fascinating to me, and I was concerned to me, because I really have respect for these kids and I want to make sure that I reach the students where they live, is a lot of my examples based on my experience and things that I think make great teaching are old. I use a fair number of films and TV shows, and with very few exceptions, I'm looking at them and say, these are all at least 10 years old. Some of them are much older. And the thing that I was very much rewarded by, because I kept checking in with the students, is this reaching you? And they were. They loved it. I mean, among the things I'm talking about is Twilight Zone, Lilies of the Field, On the Waterfront, In the Heat of the Night. So these are classics.
Story is story.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing is, I do think that storytelling has been somewhat obscured in recent times by other things, and I kept looking for. I went through the Academy Awards for the last 15 years trying to find examples that I think could hold up as well and be as good for teaching, and things that I had a personal feel for. And I was very hard pressed. I finally found Slumdog Millionaire. I said, oh, that's way over 10 years old. It's like I was surprised.
Right, but it would be like saying, well, let's find a more interesting president than Abraham Lincoln to talk about.
That's a good point.
Why?
Yeah.
We can still talk about,
right.
And a great is great. So
that's a really good point. And you can extract lessons of leadership from his administration.
Absolutely.
One of my favorite things about your book is, and it kind of covers the advice I've given to students who intern with us over at NBC for a while, or anybody getting into the business. I say, you have to develop a tough skin and be able to take criticism in any aspect of this business. In my business as being a weather forecaster, I would always say the key to being a successful television weather forecaster is being able to suffer public humiliation gracefully. But in your book, one of the favorite parts of your book was looking at you put a Remington Steele script at the end of the book, and the one that had notes that you were obviously given by one of your superiors.
By Michael Gleason, the creator.
Wow, it's
so cool.
Some of them were really interesting, but I thought if this was mine, I would want to put my head on a railroad track.
If you got that back from a teacher, your mother would be saying,
but it's really
maybe there's a better investment than college for this child.
Well, the thing that redeemed that was by the end. I chose a couple pages, select pages, and at the end he said, wow, this is a great idea. If we did this earlier, this could be a great episode. So he found what was good about it, but I loved the show. I loved Michael, and I knew that it wasn't attacking me personally. He really just had such passion for the material. Now, if you did that today, in today's environment, I think you'd get a lot of blowback about trigger, microaggression and triggers.
Right. and human resources prison. But do you have to respond to each one of their notes? What if you disagree with one? Can you go in and argue for your point?
Taking notes is an art, not a science. And my chapter is called "We Have a Few Notes" on executives. and I have said at various times, if there was anything that would drive me out of show running, it would be notes. And not necessarily the quality of the notes, but the quantity of the notes. I mean, it's just they're so endless depending on who you're talking to. But the basic smokescreen for taking a note, the advice is you don't have to answer usually notes are given in a phone call with several people on the line. And you'd hope that people could write them down because often that would force more discipline and they could see sometimes the error of their ways. But you take it on the phone call and you don't have to respond in the moment. I know at least one showrunner says, I'm not going to respond at all. I'm going to listen to everything and I'll respond later. That's fine. But the placeholder that people use is, let me think about that. Now, if you mean it, that's a legitimate way to say, I will get back to you. But then you owe it to the executive to get back to them and say, we tried to work on it, didn't work, here's why, but I did like this other note. And at the same time, if they give you a note that actually can help, it's your obligation to let the executive say, hey, thanks for that note. That really is helping us. But if you say, let me think about it, and what you're really saying is there's no way in hell I'm ever going to take that note, the executives know it, and that does not create a good, healthy relationship because in the best sense, an executive is your first audience. And just like a psychiatrist or psychologist will tell you, you don't have to defend your own feeling. You just have to defend how you act on your feeling. If somebody says to you, gee, I found this slow, what are you going to say? You're wrong? That's their feeling. And
you know what Oprah would say? I'm going to pray on it.
Really?
Yeah. So try that.
Yeah.
All right, we're going to have to wrap up because our time is running short. So I would love for everyone to go get Jeff's book. It is called Running the Show. You will find it on Amazon and wherever you purchase your books. And we want you to go get the book. It's fantastic. It's funny. It's fun to read. There's a lot of great wisdom and great information for anybody.
And really honest. It's not fluffing anybody up.
Very honest. For anybody interested in any kind of writing or any kind of creativity, the rules really apply in so many, just like improv rules. Yes, and. It's a book that celebrates us celebrating one another. Here come your closing credits. Thank you so much for joining us. We would love to continue this conversation with you on Instagram and Twitter. We are at MediaPathPod. And on Facebook, where our show page is Media Path Podcast, and our Facebook group is Media Path with Fritz and Wheezy Podcast Community. You can find full video podcast episodes loaded with bonus visual content on our YouTube channel, Media Path Podcast. You can write to us at MediaPathPodcast@gmail.com. And if you enjoy the show, please give us a nice rating in Apple Podcasts. We would appreciate that so much. You can sign up for our spicy little newsletter. Comes out only once a week, doesn't bother you otherwise, at MediaPathPodcast.com. We want to thank our wonderful guest, Jeff Melvoin. Our team includes producer Dina Friedman, John Maddox, Bill Filipiak, Thomas Hubble, Mason Brown, Lori DeWall, Garrett Arch, Nick Broussard, and you. Our theme music is by me and John Maddox. I am Louise Palanker here with Fritz Coleman. Be well and wise, and we will see you along the media path. Let's shoot a little trailer.